Hi, thank you so much for having me back. Yes, 10 minutes, a very short amount of time to answer such a big question. Ambitious today. I am Nikolai Elkins, Program Director, Creative Education over at the University for the Creative Arts, so just down the road. And today I will aim to answer the question, what's queer theory got to do with AI critical thinking in such a super short time? And I'm foregrounding a lot of this based on my doctoral research. This has been a question that I've been asking myself. Um, it's really been quite hard to avoid the generative AI noise that comes with the research that I'm currently conducting, which is looking into the phenomena of the attainment premium of lesbian, gay, and bisexual students in higher education. So what I mean by the attainment premium is the observed trend where LGB students, lesbian, gay, bisexual students, are more likely to outperform their heterosexual peers in academic achievement that's specific to higher education. This is a phenomenon that's evident in the data where full-time attainment rates for LGB students consistently surpassed those of heterosexual students in 2020 to 2021. 81.1% of full-time LGB students achieved good degrees compared to 75.2% of their heterosexual peers. While the gap is less significant than ethnicity gaps in higher education, it does begin to raise some questions about why one marginalized group might show advantage over a dominant group. And I should point out, while I'm just talking about that data, is that that attainment premium does not extend to those identifying as other sexuality within the LGBTQIA plus spectrum or to transgender students whose statistics are reported separately under gender identity in the OFS dashboards. So within this research, I've been examining how higher education prioritizes certain types of knowledge, shaping student identity and attainment with a focus on marginalized groups' lived experiences. I've been exploring how interactions and environments and curricula affect these outcomes, emphasizing concepts like academic passing and neoliberalism. Now, that term there, academic passing, that's a term that I've adapted to describe how marginalized students, specifically LGB individuals, modify behavior, language, or identity to blend into dominant academic cultures, discourse, but also perhaps to innovate within them. And that is a term that has been borrowed from straight passing, highlighting how identities are adjusted to fit perceived norms. And while in this instance it could yield positive outcomes of attainment, it does also involve a sense of identity suppression and conformity. I've also been analysing the influence of neoliberal frameworks in higher education, stressing competition, individualism, and market-driven goals as well, and how those may pressure some students to conform to narrow sets of standards of success or normalcy, which is rooted in neoliberal and heteronormative ideas. Now, I'm going to attempt to give the shortest definition of queer theory, a definition by its nature quite difficult to define. It's a theory which does emerge through social studies, social identities, challenging things like normative knowledge structures as well, aiming to deconstruct traditional categories, moving beyond as well things like gay and lesbian studies to explore all sexual identities as well. One aspect can be looking at the way that it challenges binaries that exist in the way that we've built a society. So, for example, male, female, gay, straight, rich, poor, married, single, black, white. The list could go on, I'm sure. So I've been thinking about this idea of deconstructing these binaries and the power that exists within them. And queer theory offers this opportunity to challenge fixed categories and embracing spaces that exist in between, outside, or that are in flux. And really, in contrast, large language models rely on binaries and categorization, building databases of human generated facts, often rooted as well themselves in dominant narratives. So, drawing on those principles, I've then aimed to think about how we can apply queer theory to expose the limitations of binary based systems like large language models that have to rely on categorization. So what I did as an example for today's discussion, I've demonstrated this through a question that we could all perhaps relate to in this particular space. And that was to evaluate the pros and cons of integrating technology into classroom learning. And I did what any time-pressed student in 2024 may be likely to do, and that was to ask ChatGPT to, in this circumstance, act as a level 7 PG Cert student and write the following essay title, and then ensure that it's Harvard referenced with all information in in-text citation, providing a bibliography, and for this to be written in British English. Now, for a launch into the essay, it's fantastic. The reference texts are good, they're appropriate, they exist. Perhaps one of the biggest issues we faced in the early rise of public access to ChatGPT. So this one in particular was able to reference through the web as well. So these sources do exist. Generally, they are dated. Some are seminal, such as Edward Said's text. But as a student, I could go on to somewhere like elicit.org and I could gather further information from these texts, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. It's the way that the algorithm is interpreting and selecting these texts. That's what I want to have an eye and a lens on with queer theory. Here it's assuming, this is an extract from that larger essay that it generated. It assumes a universality of all students, even that term students. Which students? Why these students? We might even begin to think about the norms created in a binary system. What students do we think ChatGPT is likely to be talking about? Why those students over others? There is even a universality in the institution and the disciplines, which creates a homogenization that's easy for a large language model to handle because it doesn't have to deal with the uncertainty, this middle ground, this something undefined. Something that I talked about last time I was here was intersectionality, and it's something that is quite absent in the production of what we have here from ChatGPT. Intersectionality being the way that multiple combinations of identities such as race, gender, class, sexuality, and more can have an impact on things like discrimination and privilege of an individual. And that's not to the fault of the individual, but a systemic disadvantage that exists preventing certain people from getting on. That's ignored in ChatGPT's response. It does talk about a digital divide that may affect low-income students, but it doesn't draw on compounded marginalization that may be reflected in intersectional issues. Perhaps something like age and socioeconomic disadvantage. How might that be different for some students, and why might that be avoided by ChatGPT? Again, it's that muddiness, it's that uncertainty, it's that aspect of the individual. The next aspect, before I go on to talk about the references, is that there is a focus on market-driven outcomes for technological integration in here throughout this essay that's produced, an assumption on what the global economy is and or needs without any specific definition, what is needed and required from this homogenous student group. We are told that some of the competencies listed are crucial for success, but it also fails to acknowledge that success may be also something that isn't quantified in just getting a job, but also getting on in a job, or impacted, as mentioned, by other factors of intersecting disadvantage there as well. And now finally, just talking about this essay is the references. What is it relying on? What is ChatGPT relying on? So I would question this second reference. So I went to examine this one, and this particular one examines student engagement online during the pandemic. And it primarily focuses on Hong Kong students and overlooks the impact of multiple forms of disadvantage that may affect students. Whereas other studies from UCU or Advanced HE highlight how things like online learning during the pandemic, it limited access to support networks and exposed some students, particularly LGBTQIA plus students, to quite unsupportive home environments. And those nuances predominantly are absent from what ChatGPT is relying on in terms of the sources that it's drawing from. But it also raises another interesting question, and that is the question of the sources. And this is one that I've just started to question. I'd be really interested to hear from more people on this one, is what does ChatGPT have access to? And what does that reveal about the knowledge being generated? While yes, it uses websites, books, and open access journals, the latter, the most intriguing for me for this question, is that there are publishing barriers that exist globally. For instance, groups outside of the UK or with English as an additional language often turn to open access journals, which may be easier to publish in, which is then easier to scrape by ChatGPT because it's not behind a paywall. So over time, with ChatGPT having an access to a broader range of global perspectives beyond the dominant global north, what's that going to mean by what it's producing? Really interested for that as a question. But it does also question things around, of course, the continued conversation around credibility, particularly regarding peer review rigor. And I'll just close. I'm just slightly over that 10-minute time here, just with where I began with that question of what's queer theory got to do with AI critical thinking. So I've kind of apply this to some potential actionable steps that I'll be thinking of in my teaching and learning practice, which is to think about spotlighting and identifying what or who is missing in an AI generated content, examining whose interests are being served by what's generated and how power structures might influence the narratives being created by artificial intelligence in the way that it's interacting in that binary system. I would begin to question the oversimplification of the data that ChatGPT is drawing on and explore who benefits from those simplifications and whose privileges are left unexamined. I would embrace some of that complexity and embrace a mindset that values fluidity, uncertainty, resisting some of the temptations to always categorize or simplify nuanced identities and experiences, and develop some discussions that welcome diverse interpretations and perspectives, and really program your algorithm to do the same, prompt for inclusivity. And finally, I would look to challenge and critically examine what is considered knowledge by the generative AI tool you are using, and how you and your students can begin to confront the response and look to other sources that give a more holistic interpretation, and consider how other cultural, social, or historical contexts may see this differently, challenging things like stereotypes and assumed fixed categories used, and finally, challenging some of the hierarchies that are reinforced in the output. And that's it from me. Thank you so much. If you're interested in any of my research, you can reach out to me at nikolai.elkins@uca.ac.uk. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you. And look at the reactions coming in. So I think that's clearly resonated with a lot of people. We've probably got time for one question. So if you would like to ask Nikolai a question, if you could raise your hand, we'll allow you to unmute yourself so you can ask a question. Oh, there we've got one there. Mike, just a second, Mike. You should be able to unmute yourself, Mike.
Yeah, I'm very confused. The original versions of ChatGPT made up references because it's a generator, not a retrieval thing. The newer versions can do a search on the internet for references that are related to the topic, but it's not using those references to make the statements. It's basically doing a lookup of references that link to what it's generated. So I'm a bit confused at the way you presented how it presents references.
So I'm also confused about the question. So the way that it presents the references, I didn't alter those in any way. Those were produced by ChatGPT by asking them to produce the reference list as Harvard reference. So maybe I've misunderstood the question.
It can. What I'm saying is the original version made them up. Now it can search the internet and give you a reference list. What I'm saying is the reference list has got nothing to do with what it said. It's a generator, not a search engine. So what it can do is it can generate something, and then it can say, okay, I've said this, let's go and find if there are any references related to this, but it's not using the references to create the answers.
So when I've entered this particular one, I've entered it, so yes, searching live on the web for this particular one, and giving in-text citations, which are predominantly pulled from the abstracts from the sources that are listed in the reference list, and that's how it's worked in that way.
Right. Okay. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment, but it's a generator, so it might get some of them right, but it's going to hallucinate.
Sure.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for the comments. We are kind of running over time now, so if we could kind of carry on a discussion maybe in the chat, that would be great. But thank you so much. Another great talk, Nikolai. And yeah, thank you for coming back and for sharing kind of your great research. So thank you.
Thank you.